Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to apologize in advance if my voice is a little scratchy. Murphy decided to give me a head cold on the day of my webcast, so I'll try to pluck ahead here, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining me. Today we are going to be talking about preparing enterprise applications to submit to the iTunes App Store. And when I say preparing, I'm not talking about running it through Xcode and getting it uploaded. I'm talking about all the administrative and logistical things you're going to have to do starting from the day that you decide you are going to implement an enterprise app for your company to your launch and beyond. So there's going to be very little code today, but there's going to be a lot of practical knowledge about what is involved in maneuvering apps into the store when you work in a large company. A little bit about me before we get going. I've been a software engineer for upwards of 33 years now, currently working for a major ISV in the Boston area. Company's about an $800 million company with about 3,000 employees, about 600 engineers. I was their first iOS developer. I was the lead developer and pretty much wrote all the code for the iOS implementation of the first product we shipped this year. We're currently getting ready to ship our second iteration of that product. So I've spent about 18 months now working with developing iOS enterprise applications in a large setting. I also have a new book out entitled Developing Enterprise iOS Applications. It's currently in pre-publication status. You can get an early release version of it by going to the O'Reilly.com website. It will be out shortly. We were waiting for iOS 5 to come out, so now that it's available, I'm going to be putting in the last few things I needed to, largely around testing applications that we were holding on to see if they fixed some problems in the Gold Master release of iOS 5. But that is available now. It covers the material we're going to cover today in more depth, as well as things like testing, concurrent development, dealing with source control systems, automated builds, talking to back-end and legacy servers, and a host of other topics that, again, were mainly things that I discovered in the process of getting a fairly significant iOS app to market for my company. So let's start by talking about what the essential problem is when you are developing enterprise applications in a large company. Apple has a particular view of what a developer is, and that's this artisanal engineer working in a small group or by themselves, beautifully crafting this gorgeous app that they're going to upload and maintain to the store. And it's really everything from Xcode to the App Store to even the contractual stuff you do with them really is designed around one person or a small group. Now, of course, if you work in a large company, you know that they have a very different model of what development is about. It's about large teams. It's about concurrent development, about automated builds, about very rigid sometimes and mechanized processes for getting apps to market, really, in their case, software packages. They have defined ways they do patches. They have defined release cycles and defined QA practices. And in a lot of cases, there is an inherent impedance mismatch between the way Apple thinks that you should do things and the way that your company thinks that you should do things. And what does that mean for you? Well, it means a lot of stomach pain, because you as a developer really want to spend your time developing the application. You want to focus on the technical problems and the interesting UI and all these things. And the reality is, especially if you're one of a small group of Apple developers inside of a large company, you pretty much are the only guy who really knows how the process of getting the app to market works, a lot of the technical details of how apps work. And so you're going to spend a lot of time interfacing with the rest of your organization, talking to people that normal developers in your company may never talk to, like your legal team. because you are essentially an army of one here. You are probably going to be the person responsible for educating the rest of your organization about how the Zen of Apple works in terms of the development cycle. So one thing that means is that you're going to be thinking about things a lot earlier in the process than you might otherwise have in a normal software cycle. So, so what this means pragmatically is you really have to plan far ahead. So if you're thinking that, oh, we're going to ship something at the beginning of October, normally the process you do in the software cycle is you say, okay, so that means we want to do our code freeze about a month before so that we can bang on it for a while in QA. So you do feature freeze 2 weeks before that, and then you figure out how big the bucket is of development time, and you back off that far. You say, okay, so we start our project back in July because that's how many weeks of development we need plus that end game. The reality is you may want to actually start thinking about things like in May. And the reason is that, again, you're going to be talking to and coordinating with a lot of people who may have never dealt with this kind of a software release process before. And you're going to have a lot of issues that you're going to have to iron out early, or they're going to come back and bite you late in the game. So the way I like to think of it is like this. If anybody in the audience has ever been pregnant or had a spouse who is pregnant, you're probably familiar with this book. And I like to call it what they call, what to expect when you're expecting. My wife and I jokingly refer to it as what to dread when you're expecting, because it was like, oh, it's week 16. We might get gestational diabetes this week. It's a very good book, but you do kind of get into this mentality of here's what you need to worry about right now. So, in a 40-week pregnancy, in week 6, you need to worry about this. In the same way, I'm going to be going through today, when you're at this point in the development cycle, here are the things that you better have nailed down or at least be thinking about at this point, because you're going to need that information shortly. So let's talk about if today your manager came to you and said, okay, we're going to do an iOS application. Here are the things that you immediately need to start thinking about. They break down into 3 major groups: your legal concerns, your marketing concerns, and your production or distribution concerns. I'm sorry I don't have a better, clever picture for that. Wikipedia only takes you so far with good pictures. So let's start by talking about the legal situation you're going to be facing with. So you may have never dealt with your corporate counsel or legal department. You may not even know who they are or where they live, but you're going to get to know them very well. I've been at my current employer for 5 years and change now, and until 18 months ago when I started this development effort, I had no idea who our legal folks were. I probably talk to them now at least monthly, and often more frequently than that, and hear the kind of things that we end up talking about. The first thing you're going to hit is the terms and conditions of being an Apple developer. Now, this is kind of a strange thing because, like, if you go and download Java from the Java website, you don't have to agree to a bunch of terms and conditions. There is kind of a shrink wrap EULA on it, but you don't need to say, I agree to all this stuff before you can start developing Java. Similarly for Windows stuff, although if you you get involved in their developer network, I'm sure there's an agreement you have to sign. But before you can even get into the developer forums as a corporation in the Apple land, you need to agree to the developer terms and conditions. So you're going to go through the process of signing up as a company, and you're going to get through the first few screens, and you're probably going to have to say, here's the people in the company who say that I really can, that we really are the company we say we are, because they do a little bit of identity checking. But then it's going to say, okay, here's the terms and agreements. And there's a little checkbox on it that says, I am authorized to agree to this on behalf of my corporation. Now, most Fortune 500 and Fortune 1000 companies, you as an individual developer are probably not authorized to sign contractual agreements on behalf of your corporation. So what this means is you're going to have to go to counsel and say, here is their T&Cs. Is it okay if I click the checkbox and go on? Now, there are three things that can happen here. The first thing they can say, oh, you know, they can take a day and they can read it and say, yeah, it seems reasonable. Click it, go ahead. The second thing they can say is, you know, we'd really like to change Clause 4, Section 5 to read, you know, thus instead of therefore. Now, at that point, you're in trouble because Apple has hundreds of thousands of app developers, and the probability, even if you look at a really big, powerful corporation, that they are going to want to sit down with you and hassle out the details of the T's and C's, especially for you, is pretty close to zero. Luckily, this didn't happen in our company, but I know that there are a lot of lawyers who kind of have a reflex instinct to want to change the contract just to do it. So if you're in that kind of situation, you may have to educate your legal department about whether or not that's even feasible to do, and that could become a real sticking point for you. Probably the worst case is, like some lawyers, they could say, we'll consider it, and they go off and you don't hear from them for 3 or 4 weeks. Now, the big problem with this is not so much when you first start, because all this is going to do is delay the beginning of your development process if they don't come back and say, yeah, it's okay right away. But Apple updates these T&Cs all the time. I think they've done it 5 or 6 times since we started developing our product. Every time they come out with something new like ads or in-app purchases, they revise the T's and C's. Now, the gotcha here is that if you don't agree to them, you've got like a 2 or 3 week window typically, and then you get locked out until you agree with it. So if you, let's say that you're launching your product in 2 weeks, and you get new T's and C's. Well, let's say you're going to launch your product in 3 weeks, and you get new T's and C's, and you go to your legal department and say, hey, can I sign this? And you don't hear from them for 2 weeks. Okay, you're now locked out of the store. So you can't go live on your product, even though you may have a huge marketing effort, because you haven't been given permission to check that box and go ahead. Now, there's this huge temptation, I know I felt it, to say, oh, I'll just check it and go ahead. Is it worth your job? Because, you know, the potential is there that if at some point there's a legal sticking point between your company and Apple and they say, well, you agreed to this and you never agreed to that, you could be in trouble. You've taken on authority of the company you don't have. So pretty much on day one, you need to sit down with your legal department and not only talk about is it okay to sign this, to check off this initial T's and C's, but how are we going to handle it in the future when new terms and conditions come along so that you're not trying to invent the wheel at the last moment. So that's the first thing you're going to talk to legal about. The second thing you're going to talk to them about is the EULA, the End User License Agreement. So it's not the one between you and Apple, it's the one between you and the people who download your app. If you don't do anything else and you create an app in the App Store, then it comes with Apple's stock EULA, which is shown here, and that will, it's their kind of best guess, least common denominator EULA. It's probably not the one your legal department wants you to use. So you want them to get started thinking about what EULA they want to have go in for the app. There's a place you put it in the iTunes Connect interface when you create your app. The good news is you don't need it right away. You can change it anytime up to product launch, and I think you can even change it after product launch. But again, they're going to want to start getting their pencils going to create a crafty EULA, either use the stock one that your company uses or tailor one to the mobile space. And it's probably going to be the same one if you're delivering on BlackBerry or J2ME or one of these other platforms that you're going to be using for those. But they need to start thinking about it. And you also want to ask them, do you want to have a different EULA in different countries, and do you want it translated for different countries? because both of those are efforts that, again, will have to start fairly early. The App Store does allow you to have a different EULA for different regional stores in the App Store. So the last thing you're going to be talking to your legal department about is third-party products that you're using in your product, because you want to talk to them about how they have to be acknowledged, if they can even be used. One of the gotchas with iPhone apps is this only can be statically linked, which means that anything that's using LGPL, depending on which version of the LGPL the library is licensed under, you may or may not be able to use it in your application without having implications for the source code of your application. So you need to, not only at the beginning, but all the way through your development process, whenever you bring in a third-party library, and you will, because there's a lot of useful code out there that can save you time, how do you need to let the legal department know this is going on and have them understand how it has to be done in Apple. Normally on iPhone apps, the place you put your open source acknowledgments is in the settings page. You add an extra little tab at the bottom that has a acknowledgments label on it, and you click that, you just get to a laundry list of all the licenses and all the software that's being used. If you get my book, I actually give a pointer to a useful little script someone wrote that can turn a bunch of boilerplate into settings properties so that it can just get dropped into your app without you having to handcraft it. Excuse me. So you're going to have now spent a good long time at your legal department, so it's ready to move on to your next department, which is your marketing department. Excuse me. So what are you going to be talking to marketing about? The first thing is, what do they want the App Store entry to look like? Most marketing departments like to have a lot of control over the look and feel of their branding, and the App Store doesn't give you a lot of control. You can basically give it a description, screenshots, a few things like that. There's not a lot there to customize, so you need to make that clear to your marketing department, and they need to start thinking about what they want to have in there for text. Remember that you're going to need to provide at least some placeholder text for your description and other stuff when you first create the app in the App Store, even before you put it up for sale. So they, again, need to start thinking about that early. Again, you need to also ask them if they want it internationalized, if they want to have translated App Store entries with maybe different screenshots in the native languages for different versions of the app. Our app ships now in 5 languages, so it might be nice if somebody coming in traditional Chinese had a App Store description that looked traditional Chinese. You also need to talk to them about what maybe a third-party branded site is going to look like. So if it's very first party, it's your site, not Apple's site. So if you're going to have your own marketing presence with your own website or maybe some on the web pages, you're going to want to talk to them about things like how you link to the App Store. You're also going to want to talk to them about things like minimum requirements that are needed, which kind of leads into the other thing you need to talk to them about, which is what platforms you're going to ship on. So in a perfect world, the marketing department is going to want you to ship on iPhone 1s and, second-generation iPod Touches and things like that. And the reality is you can't. You have to set a reasonable lower-end bound on what version of iOS you're going to run on and what devices you're going to support. If you're using certain features like the camera, we're using now in our app the camera for barcode scanning in the latest release. And there are just some iPhones that even though they can run the iOS version that we ship on, the camera isn't good enough. So we had to say it just won't support that. With our first releases of software, we basically cut it off at first-gen iPad, which I think is iOS 3.2. With the current release, we've kind of moved up into the present day a little bit more, and we're making the cutoff at iOS 4. Now, if you want to use some of the cool new features that are coming out in iOS 5, like storyboarding, then you are going to have to make iOS 5 be your cutoff point. And that has implications for what devices are supportable. We had to have a discussion with marketing and with the product manager about, what is the kind of universe of what people are running right now, and is that a big enough universe for us to want to make the cutoff there. We were able to make the case to cut off at iOS 4 because I think 90% of all current iOS devices are running iOS 4 or later. So we were able to make a case that that was good enough for us. The last folks you got to talk to is your production, shipping, distribution folks. And I say, shall we ship a brick here? Because for those who don't know, that alludes to an old practice at the end of the quarter. If you try to get your revenue numbers up but you didn't have enough product, you would, stick a brick in the box and ship it so you could recognize the revenue. Not an ethical practice, but it did happen. What it refers to here is you may have customers who, for example, for contractual reasons, are supposed to get a copy of the app in a tangible form, like on a CD. So certainly for desktop and workstation and server software, that's pretty easy to do, and in fact it may be required. For BlackBerry and J2ME and Android, depending on the carrier, you can actually put a copy of the app on the CD, and they can put it on a server on their local network, and people can install from it. For iOS, what are you going to put on there? Because you can't put the development copy, because you can only install that if you've got a development qualified device that you've turned into a development device. You can't put an ad hoc signed one there because they're not going to be on the provisioning profile. You can't put an enterprise copy on there because it is a violation of the enterprise license to give it to anybody who isn't at your physical companies, the company that made it. You can't put the App Store version on there because you can't install an App Store signed copy of their application from anything but the App Store. So what are you going to, if you're contractually required to give them something for the iPhone version on a disk, what are you going to give them? You got to give them a reboot.txt that has a pointer to the App Store link. You're going to have a discussion with your distribution people about this. In our case, I think what we ended up doing is putting a copy of the App Store version on it just so we could check it off. Sometimes you're going to find you're going to be doing that. It's just doing things because it's how it's normally done, even though it's meaningless in the iPhone universe. So the other thing you're going to have to talk to them about, these are probably the people who also do your build engineering, is what is the build environment going to be? Now, again, Apple is really big into this one-man army, one-man band. You develop it on your desktop, you run Xcode, you archive it, you upload it to the App Store, you're done. Not really the way that most large companies like to do their builds. They are much more into this kind of an environment where you've got big server farms and automated builds using something like Hudson, and you have automated regression testing on it, and it gets installed automatically onto servers that then you can test against, and the version you ship is one that was essentially the last one you did a QA on. It's possible to do that in the Apple universe. In fact, if you read the book, I have a whole chapter on automated builds. What we do right now is actually pretty slick, where when you run the nightly build, it checks out the source tree, the Xcode project from our source control system. It does a build on it using Hudson. Then it automatically injects the current build number into the version number as the very minor version number of the app. It then uses a site called TestFlight, which I highly recommend you check out, to upload an enterprise-signed version of that to TestFlight, which means that all of your testers get automatically notified that there's a new version, and they can then install it directly onto their device. So it's possible to do this whole automated build and test environment, but it takes work and it takes time. So there's a few other people we're going to talk to early on in the process. One of them is going to be your UI UX folks, These are the people who make your beautiful application beautiful. I know I, as a developer, if I was left to my own devices to create user interfaces, they would be pretty gross. But they may not be used to a lot of the conventions that Apple uses. It's really good to get them, for example, a copy of the Apple Human Interface Design document that talks about the things that are kosher and not kosher to do in the Apple universe. A lot of UX folks really want to take full control of the UI and do a lot of non-Apple-y things, and it's okay to do that, but you have to watch it, because depending on what you do, if you start taking something that's got an Apple way of doing things and change it slightly, it's ironically sometimes taking something that's stock and making it work a little bit differently is more hazardous than doing something that just totally doesn't look like an iPhone app, because Apple can be very sensitive about taking a stock control and making it work in a way that isn't stock, because you're violating the human interface design paradigms that we set up, and that can get bounced. And then it's rejected from the App Store. You also need to talk to them about things like what kind of assets are acceptable. You usually want PNGs. You're going to have to explain to them that if you're especially deploying on the iPad, the iPhone 4, and the iPhone 3, you have to deal with Retina, iPad, and stock iPhone resolutions. They may have to give you 3 copies of many of your assets, especially things like desktop icons. So it's good to let them know what it is that you're going to need early. You also need to just talk to them about the process of how they're going to get wireframes to you, what looks good and what doesn't look good. The designer I worked with on this project, a lot of times he would say, I want this, but he got really hung up on things like the table views didn't have a line at the bottom below the last entry. And so you can spend a lot of time just tweaking the UI to make your UX designer happy. They also sometimes want you to take things and tweak them slightly that may seem simple to them but are really hard. The most common one I run into is, let's put something else in the nav controller bar at the top, the one that has the back title and maybe an edit button. You could theoretically put stuff in there, but A, it's a very tight, cramped space, and you don't have a lot of control over things like the width of the title, so it's very hard to put extra elements in there. Secondly, it's again starting to break the HID design paradigms. And third, it just doesn't usually look good to do it. So you can get into conversations with them about more of a negotiation than them giving you a finished design. I found it was very helpful sometimes to just have my designer sit down next to me, and we'd fire up Interface Builder and load on the current one, and we'd just start tweaking around, and I'd run it and say, how does that look? That, I think, more than in traditional web design or in traditional desktop app design, is a good paradigm for working with your designers, because you do have this ability, especially with Interface Builder, to have a much more dynamic back and forth conversation with your designer. In the best of all possible worlds, get them a copy of Xcode, get them a copy of Interface Builder, and teach them how to use it, and let them do at least first cuts on the XID files. So the other people you're going to need to talk to are your QA folks, and you're going to talk to them about a couple of things. You're going to need to talk to them about what they're going to need physically if they want to run applications from in the simulator. Then they're going to need to have Macs, because you can only run a simulator on MacBooks and iMacs and Mac Pros and things like that. So if they've just got a Windows box, they're not going to be able to test the application on anything but a device, because they can't run the simulator. You need to talk to them about what kind of tests you want created. You could do OC unit testing. It looks like in iOS 5 you can even do UI-based OC unit testing, which is going to be really nice. You can do UI automation framework testing, which is a real pain in the butt to use and is kind of hard to automate, but has the advantage that then you're writing them in JavaScript, and maybe some of your QA folks have JavaScript proficiency. You want to talk about code metrics like CCN, code complexity numbers that may need to be generated. There are some tools to do that. And just in general, what is the QA cycle going to look like? How are they going to test it? How are they going to distribute test stuff to the testers? Again, the thing we ended up doing is using test flight, and pretty much now they don't test using the simulator at all. They just test the nightly build on physical devices, which is nice because the physical devices are the closest to reality, especially when we're doing things like testing camera-based things or other alternative input devices like the gyroscope. You can't even really effectively test those on the simulator. And then finally, you need to talk to your translation team. If you're going to internationalize the app, there's some best practices for internationalizing from a code perspective, but that's not even really an enterprise thing. That's just a good practice. You can get documentation in a lot of places on how to internationalize your app, but at the end of the day, if you did it right, you're going to end up with a string property file that you're going to have to give to your translation team. They're going to need to translate it, get back to you. You first have to have a conversation about that, the UTF-16 files, make sure that they can handle those, but also how you're going to handle things in the long term when you come up with your second release and you have a mix of new and old strings, how you're going to identify that and translate it and which ones need to be translated. Then you also need to have some way of showing them the amount of real estate that's available to them. For tags, we actually ended up in the placeholder text, which shows up as a comment in the string property file. We ended up including in that a bracketed number, which is approximately how many characters we thought they would have to work with on the application, or on the message to make it fit into the box. All right, we're going to take a little break here for a second. I've got a couple polls I want to do. So this is a good place to do the first one. Let's find out who's actually using applications right now. So hopefully you have the poll up now, and if you can take a couple of seconds and answer the poll, someone let me know if they are not seeing the poll. Let's just see what people are using, or rather what state they are in their application. So I'll give you another 30 seconds or so. And I will take a drink. All right, so let's see what the results of it were. All right, so it looks like most people are looking to put an app out in the next year. It doesn't look like a lot of people currently have apps out. So those people who are in that purple column, buy my book, because it'll help you quite a bit with the stuff you're going to be challenged by. So let's move on to our timeline of things to worry about. So now let's say it's a month before the release. What are you going to be worrying about then? Let's look at a kind of a calendar view. So if you think that you're going to be delivering at the end of the month here, when do you need to have your app ready to go up into the App Store? Now, right now it takes about 3 or 4 days to get an app approved in the App Store. I think the last time we ran through it ran 4 days. So you might think, oh, I can count back a week and do my final upload here, and I should have plenty of time. But the reality is, if you do that, what happens if this happens, right? What happens if 2 days before your launch, it gets rejected for some reason? You use some API call in a third-party library that they decided they didn't like, and so they bounced your app. So you're not going to have time. There are emergency measures you can do to get a reevaluation that involve going to a web form, and you fill out the form and say, oh, please, look at it again. And in fact, we used that the first time around when we shipped our product, because not that there's anything wrong with our app, but the back-end test server that you needed to run against to test the application that we had publicly available and we had in the testing comments for Apple went down right before they tried to test it, and we didn't notice. So when they tried to test the app, they couldn't connect and they bounced the app. So we used the forum and we got them to do a quick turnaround reeval on it, which was good because we had a major press presence planned around the launch of the app, and it would have looked really dumb if we had to say it will be available in the Apple App Store in a few days. You see that actually happen a lot, including companies like Google, where they'll launch on all other platforms except Apple, and they'll say in the App Store soon. And I really think there's no excuse for that. I think you should have it ready to go at the push of a button when you're ready to launch. But so what this means for you is you really want to be thinking about this. You really want to have your app ready 2 weeks before you're ready to launch, so that if it gets rejected, you've got an opportunity to do a resubmit and still make your dates. So when you're looking at your calendar, if it's the 1st, you don't have 3 weeks to get to your final binary. You really have 2 weeks. One way you can kind of protect yourself from this is to do a trial submit like at the beginning of the month. You probably have your code pretty much ready to ship at that point. And what you have to remember is you can upload and get an app approved without making it go live. There's 2 ways you can set it when you upload an app. You can say either I want it to go live as soon as Apple approves it, or you can say I want it to go live when I say it goes live after Apple approves it. So you can upload a binary that you think is pretty close to shippable, but may have a bug or two left in it at the beginning of the month, and make sure it doesn't bounce for some stupid reason from Apple's approval process, and then you can always upload another one later in the month. But if something goes really wrong and that second version just can't get approved, you'd have a fallback of going live with that first version so that you'd have something to go up on the day that you're launching. Obviously, if you're not planning some big coordinated launch effort, it's not as much of a factor. You can just let it go live when it goes live. But, especially if you're trying to coordinate it against 3 or 4 other platforms you're deploying on, it's good to have it ready to go. So at this point, you also probably want to be talking to a support organization. Most of the time, your support organization is used to this model of support. They have a call center, customer has a problem, they call in, and it gets logged as a bug, and then somebody goes checks it out and gets back to the customer. But that's not usually how bugs come in to Apple iOS apps. They normally come in through the App Store, and usually with some really low loading associated with your app, saying, I tried to run it and it crashed. So it may very well be that you've still got stuff coming in through the call center, because remember that probably if it's an enterprise application, you sold it to a company, the company told the users to install it, so then the users then complain to the company, and the company complains to you through the normal channels. But depending on what the enterprise app is, it may very well be that the end users are the ones who get the initiative to download it, and then you may be seeing bug reports showing up in the App Store. You may be seeing crash logs showing up in iTunes Connect. And so you want to have, again, this conversation with your support organization about how you're going to get bug reports in and deal with them. You also want to talk to them about patching, because in most large enterprises, they don't do just ad hoc patching, except maybe for an emergency patch. Instead, what they do is they'll have a monthly or a quarterly or a half-yearly bug release, and they bundle all their fixes into it, and they send it out to the customers. That's not the way that the Apple world works. In the Apple world, when you've got a fix, you just upload it to the App Store, and everyone just gets it the next time they update the app. So again, there may be this real temptation. Oh my God, I double released an object, and I'm getting SIG-aborts in my application, and nobody likes it, and they're all giving me 1 star, and they're calling me names, and I can't get a date. So the temptation may be there to just fix it and upload it to the store. And your support organization is going to see you as a cowboy who went out there and just put something in without proper QA, without going through the proper channels. So again, you need to have a conversation with support about how are you going to handle emergency fixes, how are you going to handle periodic fixes, do they need to go through a full QA process, how do they have to be coordinated with maybe a training organization, does support need to know when you change things, when you add new features, who needs to know about it. That's a conversation that doesn't have to happen right away, but before you release the product, you want to have that conversation with your support organization. So at the end of the day, the main thing you want to worry about in the last week is who's going to push the button and when are they going to push it. It can take several hours to get an app live in the App Store once you push the button. And in fact, for foreign stores, I'm told it can take even longer. So if you have a coordinated thing where you're going to do a press release on a Monday morning about your brand new app, and you push the button Monday morning and it's not up till noon, you've kind of missed the boat. So what we actually did was we put it up the previous evening, Sunday night, under the theory that nobody was really going to notice it. We weren't stealing any thunder from the press releases that were going to go out Monday morning, but it still gave us a peace of mind that it was already live and ready to go. It may be something so sensitive that you don't want to give anything away ahead of time, so then you may just have to live with the possibility that you've got a window of time when it may not be up in the store. So that's something you need to talk to your product marketing and your product management, and your marketing folks about. Who's going to make the decision to go live, when will it go live, and you need to communicate to them exactly what it's going to mean for it to go live. So if you went through all of this process, hopefully on launch day you can just be sitting out there at the beach enjoying yourself with not a care in the world, and hopefully you haven't had something really bad happen instead. Again, our really bad thing happened a few days before the app when it got bounced because of that server issue, and that did generate some stomach acid. But actually on release day, things went really smoothly. We did have a major press release about our product, and it launched pretty flawlessly. Everyone was happy. It was one of the more proud moments in my life because I had written pretty much the entire iPhone app. So for me, it was a real sense of having put something very tangible that I had put a lot of work into out into the world. So hopefully your launch day is going to be like that. You're going to have covered all your bases and going to have a smooth release. And then all you have to start worrying about is what gets covered in the next chapter in my book, which is how do you deal with maintaining the app in the long term, especially as you go through different versions of your server and your client. If you want details on that, again, the book is available in the store now, and the finished print version should be out around the end of the month. With that, we've got about 15 minutes left. I'd like to thank you all for listening to me blather for 45 minutes, and I guess we're ready to take some questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, James, for that wonderful presentation. We do have a few questions that came in. Did you want me to read them out loud for you, or did you want to take a peek?
I'm looking at the Q&A now. I'll just kind of go through them one by one to the first one, which was from Anne-Marie asking about export control classification numbers. That actually did not come into play with us, so I can't give you a good answer, but I suspect that you're going to want to talk to your legal department about that. Mind you, you can control what app stores your product sells in, so if there are countries or regions that it's not appropriate for you to sell your application in, then you can, because of things like encryption, then you can restrict them out of there. I don't know what the granularity of that is. I believe you can checkbox down to the individual country what countries you want your store available in. All right, so Chad asks, what kind of items in the legal agreement might give a legal department pause? There's, in the Apple one, actually, it's a fairly innocuous agreement. So the main thing you always have to look at is anything that's about intellectual property. I don't think Apple makes any intellectual property claims in their agreement. So really, our legal department doesn't have a lot of issue with that. We had a lot more issues with them looking very closely at things about rights in the third-party open source agreements, where we had one LGPL 2.1 library that we had to very carefully think about whether that had any implications on our source code and our objects. Again, lawyers can decide that they don't like anything. And in that case, you're just stuck with trying to make them feel as comfortable as possible. If you have a reasonable legal department, I mean, very large companies don't have any trouble with the Apple terms and conditions. So, unless you've got some particularly persnickety lawyer, you shouldn't really run into issues with it. And it looks like the last question here is, how worried should someone be about IP companies such as LoadSys? Any frameworks someone should shy away from? There's obviously in-app purchases is currently under a legal cloud because of some IP issues. But this is one of my pet peeves. I mean, there is pretty much anything you do in software now, there's some junk patent out there that's going to come and bite you if somebody really wanted to. So, the caveat that I am not a lawyer, it's, how well is your company's patent portfolio? If you're getting attacked for something that is an Apple feature like in-app purchases, the presumption would have to be that it's Apple's issue, not yours, although obviously LoadSys decided otherwise there. If it's a feature of your product that's not a generic Apple thing, but just something that your product does, then presumably you're already running into these problems or these issues with your mainstream product, and unless this is a one-off that you're doing, it's only mobile, you've probably already thought about whether you have IP infringement issues. But this is an open sore in the software industry. You have to judge the likelihood that anybody is going to want to come after you. Some of it is kind of the same as worrying about if someone's going to steal your car. A really determined lawyer can sue you regardless of what you've done to protect yourself. It's just what is the nuisance likelihood that someone's going to decide you're a good target. But I don't think there's anything in particular when you're developing applications you should shy away from, except for things like in-app purchases that have already been identified as things that are under a legal cloud. All right, so we have, I think that was all the questions we had. So unless anyone else has a question, I think I will save my voice and end things now.
All righty. We did have one final question that came in. If you have enough voice to answer it, the person asks, can you discuss a little bit about recommended distribution strategies?
Sure. So really, you've got a limited number of choices here. If you want something that the general public can use, it has to go in the App Store. So then, it's an all or nothing thing, certainly at a country level. If you are distributing to other enterprises, if it's a B2B thing, there are really two possibilities. And one of these is fairly new. One of them is you can basically ask that company to get an enterprise license, and then you could build a special version of your application signed with their license, which they can then distribute inside their company, but because of the contract, can only distribute inside their company. There's also the ability now to do a boutique app store. Apple now has, through a company that they own, and there's another company out there, you can do a boutique store where, unfortunately, it looks like the ones I've seen so far, you do have to charge something for it because they want to take a cut off of it. But you can basically have stores where a business can come to that store and we can have a specific version of the software for that business. And again, in my book, I mentioned a couple of those. I don't remember them off the top of my head. One of them is an Apple spinoff. The last possibility is for something purely in-house, you could just use your own enterprise license, and that's also very good. We started out with an ad hoc license, which is where you have to put the universal device identifier number of every device that's going to run the app into the provisioning profile that the app's signed with, and that was an awful lot of headache for me keeping the provisioning profile updated. We had over 70 devices out of the 100 you allowed provisioned out, and it was kind of like I spent a couple hours a week just updating that. We just recently got an enterprise license, and we now sign the test version of the app with the enterprise license and use, again, this thing called Test Flight to distribute that automatically to the testers, and that's really reduced my workload. You can also use that same mechanism to distribute internal enterprise on the applications. You can also, for internal applications, set up a website with a little, you put a little piece of metadata on a web page, and you can then point your browser at it and download an enterprise-signed application.
All right. That is all the questions I see that came in. So with that, folks, we're going to say a very big thank you to James for his wonderful and informative presentation. Thank you so much, James, for presenting that, for sharing all your knowledge and expertise with us. We thank all the attendees that came today to listen to you. And we'd like to remind everyone to join us tomorrow. We do have another webcast at 10 o'clock Pacific Time, Troubleshooting Windows Update and Service Pack Problems with Mike Halsey. Hope to see you all there. This will conclude the webcast. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.